Right, folks, so good morning. And thank you very much for coming along to our first Charities Conference, our first of what we hope will be a series. And we've designed it very much with you in mind. It came from both the conversations that we have every day, every week with charities, and also when we were doing some research, we found there was a clear need for another opportunity to exchange information, particularly in relation to some of the technical areas that we're going to be covering. So we're emphasising that it very much is an opportunity for you. Tell us what you want to hear, and we will aim to provide that for you. These are the key points which came up when I was talking to people about attending. So we're going to attempt to cover some of those. But many of you will know far more about these subjects on a day-to-day basis than we do. And therefore, we encourage you to have a wee blether at lunchtime. You're welcome to take notes. However, we will be sending both notes and a copy of the recording, which our friend Mike at the end here is doing at the moment. So those will all be issued next week to you. And that's really all I have to say, other than to hand over to our founder and senior partner, Brian Wood. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for attending today. It's absolutely brilliant to see so many at our very first conference. Hopefully, as David says, it will be the first of many. My job today, I'm just the warm-up act really. So I'm not going to do anything too technical. I'm just going to probably introduce a bit more about Accountants Plus really and who we are. Just a quick show of hands. How many people had actually heard of Accountants Plus before they were given an introduction to the event? Not that many. That's probably one of the main reasons we're having events like this, really to get us better known. In terms of Accountants Plus, as a company, we're almost 25 years old. I basically founded it from my bedroom with a 10 grand loan and about 2 clients. And we've expanded quite a bit. We're now at 1,200 clients and 35 staff with a plan to get to 75 staff within the next 5 years. One of our main areas we want to focus on is to get a lot more of the charity sector, if you like. We'll go over who some of the clients we already have, but certainly we see the charity sector as a main part of our kind of growth. Let's pick this up. Yeah, just for those that don't know, this is our current premises. It's more or less just across the road. This is what it looked like if you're flying over it with a helicopter. Which presumably a lot of you won't be doing. It's very convenient for our clients and our staff. We've actually got another sort of 15 spaces just at the bottom of the road there and off the slide. So clients have got parking facility at the back as well. So we occupy both floors in there and have been there for approximately 16 years now. Down to earth, these are just some internal pictures of our office. Really, something that's very important to me is our office and our facility has got to really kind of reflect who we are. We're very modern, forward-thinking accountants, and we feel our office environment has to reflect that. Most of our staff actually work in the office. We are kind of bucking the trend in terms of most accountants are working from home these days. I think a mixture of because we've got the friendly environment and a lot of our staff are actually within 15-20 minutes of the office. So most of them actually want to come in as well, which is absolutely that's brilliant. So why Accountants Plus? Well, we're already established in the charity sector, but we basically want to have a bigger market share. What we find as accountants is there's lots of tiny firms in the marketplace. We are actually the top 5 in terms of the size of our team. What was that, David?
Me, I know. Can you believe it?
Yeah. Do as I say, not what I do. Okay, so really what we're demonstrating here is basically 90% of accounts firms can't really cope with bigger projects. Other important point is actually there's only about 20% of the audits, or sorry, the accountants actually do audits or registered to do audits. And there's even some of those who choose not to do charities. So as far as the charity sector is concerned, there's a limitation in choice, and that's one of the surprising, I have to say, to some degree, when you speak to charities, they really struggle to find accountants appropriately qualified. So what demonstrating here is just a small sample really of the clients that we currently work with, and just really showing the diversity of it really, from football clubs, down to mosques and everything else in between, I suppose. So we are looking to expand our presence within the charity market and to get it known that we are charity experts. In terms of our speakers today, we've got Fiona Struthers. She's an associate of our firm. Her specialism is charity auditing. Fiona's got somewhat 100 years experience, haven't you, Fiona? Yeah, I have to sit next to you, I forgot about that. We've got Martin Nicol, who's our technical tax manager. He's got a lot of specialist knowledge within the charity sector as well, particularly VAT issues, which is a real bugbear within that particular sector. We've got, from outside Accountants Plus, we've got Stephen Sweeney, who is the CEO at Vaslan. He'll tell you all how to get more money, no pressure. So these are just some of the suggestions that we have for future events in terms of topics. So we can obviously, there'll be further networking, no after and during the event today and follow-ups, but this is what we're proposing to have as subjects in future events. Obviously we can tailor that, to suit. So really that's all I had to say. So I'm just a warm-up act. So next up is Fiona, who will tell us loads of technical stuff.
Thank you, David. Thank you. As Brian said, I'm Fiona Struthers. I'm in charge of charities and audits at Accountants Plus. I've been dealing with charities for years and years. Not 100 years, Brian. Not many years at all. I'm very, very young. So, yes, you can see that my topic is charity governance and accountability, which at first sound you think, oh my goodness, that sounds a bit dull. But I hope by the end of it that you've got some really useful information and things to take away thinking, oh, I didn't know that, I really have to go on and get that done. Or I really need to tell the trustees of the charity that I'm involved with the things that they need to get done. So, the outline of what I'm talking about today, and this is me from now until lunchtime, so you've got me for a wee while. As you can see, there's four main topics there. The first two I will just go over very quickly. The real part of today's talk is point 3 on the trustees' responsibilities. There is so much involved in that, and that really is the governance topic that I'm wanting to talk about today. And there has been some changes to Oscar Powers. There's been some changes already this year, some just this month, and other ones that are in the offing for next year. So I want to talk a bit about that as well. So as I said, just quickly, I want to tell you the different types of charities. So you can either be an unincorporated charity, or at the other end of the scale, a limited company, which is usually limited by guarantee. And the one in the middle there is the Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation, which they call SCIOs, which doesn't really trip off the tongue particularly well. And that's a halfway house between, so the advantage of the SCIO is that the trustees do have a certain amount of limited liability, which they don't have with the unincorporated ones. But on the other hand, they don't have to comply with the Companies Act legislation and submit accounts to the Companies House and that type of thing. So it's quite a popular option And it is possible that if you are set up as one of the other types to convert to that. Easier if you're unincorporated, but it can still be done if you are, in fact, a limited company. So moving on, accounting for charities. I just really want to kind of run through that quickly for you, just to give you an idea. As you can see, there's different types of accounts. Smaller charities tend to do receipts and payments accounts. That's just money's in, money's out. Slightly larger charities and smaller charities that choose to do this would do accruals accounts, and that just means you're also bringing in money that you're still to get and things that you've got to pay out, and that can be quite useful, really, because if you've just done receipts and payments, yes, you've got that amount of money in the bank at the end of the period, but it might paint a bit of a false picture because you've promised money, the next week that you've got to pay out. So it's sometimes worthwhile to do it that way. And then the next thing I to mention is external scrutiny. So all charities have to have some kind of external scrutiny. Now, the larger charities, and that is those who have income in a year of over 500,000, or gross assets of 3.26 million, or, and this is the bit that sometimes catches people out, or is mentioned in the charity's governing document that says they have to have an audit. Any of these would require their annual accounts to be audited, and any other charity would have to have an independent examination. And then there's rules about what type of independent examination and who can do it. So sometimes you need somebody like me to do the independent examination, and some of the smaller charities can have somebody that's independent of them. There's different options that are for that. So when you're preparing your accounts, whether it's receipts and whatever type that it is, you've got to look at your funds. So charities can have 3 different types of funds. You can have restricted funds, you can have unrestricted funds, or you can have designated funds. So restricted funds are that somebody has given the charity money and said, you must use it for this, or you fundraised and said, I want you to give us money for this thing. Then you have to use it for that particular thing. Unrestricted funds is any money that the charity has received that can be used for what that charity does. And designated funds are also unrestricted funds, but it's where the trustees have thought, right, okay, we do have a pot of money. We haven't been told we have to do something specific with it, but we know that this particular issue is going to happen in our charity, and we just want to set something aside for it, and that's why they designate it. So it could be repairs, if they know that there's repairs like coming up for your building that you operate from, or it could be for redundancy costs, which sounds a bit negative, but in some cases it might be prudent. If you have staff that have been there a long time, it can sometimes be a useful thing to have a fund like that. But that, I see, is a still unrestricted fund. And lastly, I see it's just pointing out what you actually have to submit to OSCR, which is the financial information and this external scrutiny report. And on the top of that, the trustees have to write a report, and there's certain things that have to go into that. So that's the sort of potted history, really, of the sort of types of charities and the accounts. But what we're really moving on to is the main bit today, which is what trustees are responsible for, and then what their specific duties are, but mainly what things trustees are concerned about or ought to be concerned about, and that really is the main thing that I want to talk about today. Now, trustees often set up charities with the best will in the world because they want to do good, and they've got something that they really want to raise funds for, or something that they want to help or raise awareness of, but then quite often don't really realise what they're responsible for. There's so much more to it, and that's kind of really what I want to go over today. And the problem is that when charities are set up without a real understanding of the responsibilities and the duties, that's where the trustees can end up getting into trouble. And that's when I always call it the Daily Record things, the things that are splashed over the paper. And there's been loads of them. And I will be mentioning a few this morning, but obviously a recent one was Fashion for Relief, which was the charity Naomi Campbell was involved with, and she's actually been disqualified from being a trustee because the charity was found to be mismanaged. Apparently, some of the money that was raised, instead of being passed on to the charity, to the particular aim that it was meant to be for, it was being spent on cigarettes and security for Ms Campbell, and also there were payments to another trustee. And these things often happen when really trustees don't understand what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. So if you went onto the Oscar website, and just in case you don't know, Oscar is the Office for Scottish Charity Regulator, which is a charity commission in Scotland. So if you went on there, you would be able to see that they have identified what they call these main responsibilities for trustees. And it's all very wordy, but it really just means trustees have to run the charity properly. And to do that, trustees need to know what the charity is set up to do and then make sure it does it, and does it within the rules. Now, I told you I was going to give you examples of where things had gone wrong. You're bound to have heard of the Captain Tom Foundation. And so that has all been in the news. Now, that is still under investigation by the Charity Commission. This is an English case. But Mrs Ingram Moore has been disqualified as a trustee. That has already happened. And it appears, according to what's in the press, that there was some arrangement with a private firm. So there was a conflict of interest. It was regarding intellectual property rights. And this is what the Charity Commission are investigating just now. And again, it's not knowing, understanding what they're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do is the key thing here. Now, while you're on the Oscar website, you might also come across these specific trustee duties. And these are just the things that Oscar highlights that trustees must do. As you can see, there's 6 things there. At face value, they're quite straightforward, really. Make sure that the details in the Scottish Charter Register are up to date. It's just, if you've got the right contact details, they want to make sure that they've got contact details and the right email address, the right phone number address, and so on, that they're looking for. You obviously have to submit your accounts and your annual return. It's a duty of the trustees to do that, even though that could be delegated to their accountant to help with, but it is a trustee's duty. The governing document. So, governing document, you'll hear me mentioning this quite a lot. It's important that trustees actually know what the governing document says. So the governing document is either your constitution, or if you're a company, your articles of association, and it's the type of thing. It's set up the company, create these, never look at it again. But if you do look at it again and change it, you need to tell Oscar. And the reason you have to tell Oscar is because they want to check and make sure that you still meet the charity test, and that you've not changed things that they feel aren't really in line with what the charity is meant to be doing. So you do have to tell them that. Keeping records, obvious. Controlling fundraising. Again, you might not actually be doing the fundraising yourself, but the trustees are responsible for it all, and obviously just giving out accurate information, again, is really important. There's been another case, it's called Cairn Schmill. Again, this was an English case, but they have been in trouble with the Charity Commission, and it was because they didn't send in their accounts. Now, it wasn't really a case of they didn't send them in 1 year on time. I think they didn't send them in repeatedly on time, and considerably late, but there were other issues as well. Another thing for them was that the governing document said that their accounts had to be audited. Now, they were below the thresholds and they didn't actually require an audit, but because the governing document said so, then the Charity Commission said, well, you're in breach of what your charity says that you're going to do. And that's something that could have been addressed really quite easily. Okay. So this is really what trustees really should be concerned about. I've covered what Oscar have said and what's available there, but there's so much more. I mean, really, what I've said, it's just the half of it. There's so much more to think about when you're running a charity. And these are the headings that have covered. So, compliance, you can see, oh my goodness, there is loads of it. You're wanting to ensure that you're adhering to complex financial regulations and accounting standards and so on. Basically, if you're running a charity and you're a charity trustee, you're running a business and then some, because there's all these things really apply to a business, but in addition to that, you have got the Oscar regulations to comply with. But there really is so much. Deadlines, the deadline is 9 months after the end of the accounting period. Obviously, that's the same for Companies House. And HMRC, it's actually 12 months after the 9 months is for payment, but hopefully charities won't have corporation tax to pay, but they may do, and I'll leave that to Martin for this afternoon. As I will really on tax compliance. The only thing I wanted to say in tax compliance was yet another example that you will have heard of. It's Kids Company, and they were in trouble with the Charity Commission, and they were found not to have paid tax and not to pay their workers. So again, tax was an issue there. And the governing document, I have mentioned that you do need to make sure that you are complying with what your charity's governing document says. And then on top of all that, all businesses have regulations to comply with, and charities are no different. But I've sort of mentioned equality laws, something that needs to be considered, and then some charities might have to comply with the protection of vulnerable groups. So there are specifics, and all of these things really have to be considered. So the next thing really that trustees ought to think about is the charity financially sustainable? And again, there is so many things that need to be considered. So overall, you're wanting to make sure that the charity maintains a healthy financial position to support what the charity's aims are and what it's wanting to do, but still dealing with all these challenges like fundraising, like the economy and so on, and crashing dishes, clearly. So the things that I've mentioned here, the level of reserves. Trustees have to make a decision about what level of reserves they think is right for the charity. Now, when I say reserves, I mean free reserves. And what I mean by free reserves is unrestricted reserves, but not including fixed assets. Because quite often the unrestricted figure, if the fixed assets haven't been taken out, you think, oh, I've got quite a lot there. But if a lot of it's tied up in fixed assets, then it's not free for you to use. And so you do need to consider just how much is actually required for your charity. The standard is 3 months, but that is absolutely not set in stone. It could just be a monetary amount. If you think, yes, our charity needs to have £10,000 of reserves, or to meet specific things that that are going to happen. It's how the cash flow works with your charity, and what the risks are, and what things that you're going to have funds for to pay out if the income that you're expecting doesn't come in time. Then you want to look at your restricted funds against unrestricted funds. Now, obviously, I've said that the free reserves are unrestricted funds, so the restricted funds don't come into it here. But the point about your restricted funds is to make sure that you have actually accounted for them, that you have got a separate record of your restricted funds, and that you know how much is left in these funds, and that you're recording to make sure that it's been used for that purpose. A lot of charities, especially those who are very much reliant on grants, have a real issue with restricted funds. or rather, the lack of unrestricted funds is a real issue, because a lot of grant funders will fund something for a specific thing. So they may, for example, fund salary for someone, but they don't consider the overheads that are required. And the charities have all got overheads. But if the grant is only going to pay for somebody's salary and nothing else, then you've got a bit of an issue, and that can be a problem. So it's something I say that trustees really, really do need to be aware of. Fundraising challenges. So are you reliant on the same donors every year? Do you know, is there a point at which these donors are going to say, I'm going to support another charity? Fundraising events. There's a myriad of fundraising events. Everywhere you look, there's people raising funds for this, that, and the next thing. So many people doing, hikes up Kilimanjaro or taking part in marathons or whatever. And also like fundraising dinners. There are so many of them. So where does yours fit in? How does yours stand out that people are going to come to your event rather than somebody else's? It's things that you've got to consider, getting it at the right level for your supporters. Are your supporters going to come to this fundraising dinner? Will they find the cost of that too much? As there other fundraising events that are more suitable? So there's so many things. And the economy, well, I mean, again, that's out with your control, but you obviously need to be aware of it. Clearly, the budget is next week. We don't know what's going to happen there. But, once it does, what's the impact of that on the charity? And, for a while, it's been in the press about the cost of living crisis. And then more recently, about the winter fuel payment being taken away. Will that have an impact? Will that stop people who previously would have received it from giving to your charity? I think, no, I really don't have as much, spare money as I did. There's so many things to consider. And then last, but certainly not least on this list, is going concern. Trustees are responsible for assessing if the charity is a going concern. And when the accounts are prepared, you actually have to assess that for 12 months hence. Not 12 months from your year end, but 12 months from when you've signed the accounts. You're actually saying, yes, I'm happy that this charity is going to carry on. And so you've got to look at things like the income sources. Are they sustainable? If you have so-called guaranteed income, you've maybe been awarded a grant for 3 years or something like that, is there going to be any issues you getting the next instalment of it if it's requiring you to do X, Y, Z? Is that going to be a problem of any sort? Can you look at preparing cash flows? Can you look at preparing budgets to try and consider, that your charity is a going concern, because it is something, I say, that trustees are very much responsible for. So the next, I say, concern that is relevant to trustees, I say, is governance, which is what this whole topic was on. So what is governance really? It's having the right structures to make sure that the financial management is transparent and that the public trust can be maintained, is what you're really aiming for. Again, back to the Captain Tom Foundation, that was what the Charity Commission, they were investigating concerns over governance and financial matters. So it is a real issue. And a good starting point is to have a governance code. And these are the types of things that you may want to consider for a governance code. And as there's so many issues. I mean, most of these cases that I've mentioned already, governance is really the main issue. If you get the governance right, the other things really should fall into place. Now, hot off the press, there's actually a Charity Commission report today from a charity called Mermaids, and it's governance that is the issue with them. And basically they said the charity wasn't being governed to the standard that the Charity Commission expected. There's a lot of information out, but I say it has just been released today. But there are so many examples. So as you can see, dealing with disputes, that's kind of obvious. Conflicts of interest, you should have a conflict of interest policy, and you should have a register of your trustees' interests, so any business that trustees are running, or even like if they maybe work for perhaps a local authority who might be providing grants to the charity, that type of thing, or if there was anything that where the charity may be giving grants to something that the trustee is involved with. Again, it just all needs to be transparent, and a good way to deal with that is that for every trustees meeting, the first item on the agenda should be conflict of interest. And just to highlight from what's on today's agenda, is there anything that any of the trustees think may be a conflict of interest that they want to raise to make sure that it doesn't get missed, really. Meetings. So how often you have the meetings, what is actually required for your meetings, what's the quorum for your meetings. Now that's quite a good one, because your governing document will say what a quorum is for the trustees' meetings, and also say what that is for an AGM. And if you don't get that number of people coming along, then you can't actually make decisions because you've been in contravention of your governing document. And again, it's an easy thing to fix because you can amend your governing document. Just remember and send a copy to Oscar when you do it, but it can be amended. And certainly I was recently at an AGM where they were really struggling to get people along, such that we're having to phone and drag people in. Somebody actually came in their pyjamas. So it's something that, again, it can be dealt with. Collective responsibility. So you'll generally have a chairperson, you'll generally have a secretary, you'll generally have a treasurer, but that doesn't mean that just because they do specific roles as trustees that they are responsible for all these things. All of the trustees are collectively responsible. And a good example of that actually is finance. Quite often that charities end up in trouble and they're saying, oh, but, you know, the treasurer dealt with all that, you know, and you know, the treasurer turned out to be one that was stealing from them. The trustees really should be asking to see the bank statements. No harm in that. If the treasurer is saying, this is what you've got, can I just see the bank statement? And because everybody is responsible for that, it is not down to the one person. If your treasurer is preparing accounts for the meeting, then it's like, why is that up and why is that down, and so on, should at least be considered. The Karen Schmill case, which, as I say, was another Charity Commission case, that was an issue there, that everything was being left to one particular trustee. And also to consider, is there a dominant trustee, and how do you deal with that? And you know that, you know, if you're in a meeting of half a dozen people, there'll always be somebody that shouts the loudest. So, you know, have a policy about, you know, how you actually will deal with that. So, you've thought about governance code. The last thing on the governance code was financial controls, which is kind of like one of the bigger things. Or, I'm an accountant, it's what interests me. So it's a bigger thing for me. So you must consider having financial controls. If you're running any business, you ought to have financial controls. You need to look at who's doing what, who authorises what things do you check, what things do you reconcile. So basically systems and procedures, but not just for accounting, operational as well. And then check that they actually are working. Oh yes, we've got a system that does that. Well, do you actually do it? Nope. So again, trustees should be checking on that. Reserves policy, I've mentioned that already, so I don't need to repeat that. The investment policy, if your charity is fortunate enough to have surplus funds, then what is your policy on dealing with these? Is it in the best interest of the charity to keep that in a current account, not earning interest? Would it be better for the charity to actually invest that money? And if you are going to invest that money, you need to consider then what's the charity's risk profile, if they've got an ethical policy for investment, and just really to consider what is actually the best thing that's and everything that the trustees are doing is acting in the best interests of the charity, and that is one of them. And the last one, the risk of fraud, has got a slide all of its own. There's so much fraud. There is so much fraud, and trustees are responsible for preventing fraud in the charity and detecting it. And that's a big deal. There was a survey last year. There was 120 charity leaders were asked on the subject of fraud. 43% of them said their organisations had been the subject of fraud in the last year. And more than half of them were fraud perpetrated by someone inside the organisation. So it's a big deal. Trustees really need to consider where their charity is vulnerable to fraud. And then going back to the last slide, look at having procedures and checks to minimise it. You won't always catch it, but what you're wanting to do as trustees is to reduce the risk. And really, I don't say don't trust anyone, but have systems so that everyone is protected. And these systems, they protect the other trustees, they protect the staff, they protect the charity. A Scottish case at last, because I know all the ones I've been telling you have been English cases, but you will have heard of it, Rainbow Valley. And that was actually just in the news again yesterday. And Rainbow Valley was defrauded by a trustee. And what she was doing was forging the signatures of charity staff, and then she was taking cash from the account and putting it into her own account. Now, that's clearly more difficult, to try and detect and prevent, when she's actually forging signatures. But the point really is you need to be then looking at the accounts and saying, well, what was that we were paying for? That if she's forged a signature, obviously for money for herself, and recorded it in the books as something else, it's what are we actually paying for? And yes, instances of fraud happen all the time. I can remember years and years ago when, which is not quite so relevant now in that cheques are not used as much, but obviously they were being used in Rainbow Valley. But I do remember an instance where it was a member of staff who was a cheque signatory, but the cheques had to be signed by a trustee and this member of staff. But the member of staff would give the chequebook into the trustees' meeting and say, can you just sign 3 cheques and I'll fill in the details later? And they filled in the details with their own information. These things happen. This is an old case, but you might recall it in the Glasgow Tree Lovers Society. There was a lady called Bunty McSkimming, and she was found guilty of stealing £60,000 from the charity. She was the treasurer, and what she said was that, well, the Tree Lover Society had lots of money, and she was watching the news and she saw all these starving children overseas, so she wanted to give them money. So she took it from the Tree Lover Society and sent it anonymously, or that's what she said, anonymously to these charities. And as I say, she was found guilty of taking that. And clearly, money of that size should have been picked up if there were good financial controls and checks in place. So it really is a big, big deal. So you're like, oh my goodness, where do I start? This is where you start. The Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations has got really good information for charities. And one of the things that they have is this check-up. And if you choose to go on to that, then they will actually just ask you through a number of questions, and it will create an action plan for your charity, which will help with setting up this governance code and covering these things. So these are the main things that say that really should be concerns for trustees. But there's another couple of things that I wanted to mention, particularly because it is things that trustees may not be aware of, and that's notifiable events. And the gist of it is, if something big happens to the charity, you need to tell Oscar, and the trustees are responsible for telling Oscar. And again, it's something that they could get into trouble for from Oscar if something came to light and they hadn't told Oscar about it. So it's what kind of things, as I say, is fraud or things getting used wrongly. Interesting, the one at the bottom, not enough trustees to make a decision. Again, that goes back to the governing document, that make sure that you've got the right information in your governing document regarding trustees. If your governing document says you need 10 trustees and you've only got 3, then that is actually a notifiable event if you don't have enough to make that decision. How many trustees you have to have is sort of up to the charity. If you are a SCIO, you must have at least 3. Oscar don't really have like a definite number for any other type of charity, but they would say you ought to have at least 3 for any type of charity. But you should look at your governing document and see what that says, because it's such a simple thing to get sort of tripped up with, really. And the other thing that I wanted to mention in this section was payments to trustees. So some people think that trustees are not allowed to get paid at all. And other people think that there's a carte blanche and trustees can get paid the same as everyone else. And neither of these are correct. If your governing document says you can't pay your trustees for anything, then you can't. But again, you can amend your governing document and send it into Oscar. But as long as you comply with the rules, some trustees can get paid. So it's less than half, really. So you've got 3 trustees, 1 of them can get paid. But if there's a family member who's working for the charity, then that counts as the trustee. So if you've got, again, these 3 trustees and one of them's got a brother that works for the charity, then none of the trustees in that situation would be able to get paid. But it is just something that's to bear in mind. When you complete the annual return, and I'm going to mention annual return in a wee minute, that is one of the questions, were there any payments made to trustees? Now, they don't really mean reimbursement of out-of-pocket expenses. That's perfectly fine. If trustees have incurred travel expenses and so on to attend trustees' meetings, then that can certainly be reimbursed, and that doesn't come into these rules. It's actually paying the trustee for some service that the trustee would be carrying out for the charity. And there's rules about that, it has to be agreed and it has to be written, and it has to be a reasonable amount and that sort of thing, that really sort of needs to be considered. And if this is something that is relevant to your charity or something you're thinking about, Oscar have a nice flow chart which you can work through, which actually shows you what all the rules are on that. Okay, so we're nearly there with this section, but this to me encompasses everything, is risk management, because the risk management really covers your governance matters, your financial matters, your operational matters. There should be a risk assessment produced, and you can get templates for these risk assessments, but they're sort of in a traffic light system. And the gist of it, you look at things that might happen to your charity and say, well, what's the chances of that happening? And if it happened, what would the impact be? And so, yes, it may be, yes, there's quite a big chance this thing may happen, but really it wouldn't affect us in any way or any significant way, so we're fine with it. As opposed to something that is really very risky, we might consider maybe we won't do this, or we might take other steps, we might put in other policies because of this, we might take out specific insurance for it. And or we might do training for this event. It depends on what really it is. But the trustees really do need to have an action plan for risks. So then you think, well, what does she mean? What kind of risk? I can't think of any risks. A really topical one actually would be if the charity's got buildings and if there's any rack in the building, then that clearly is something that should be considered by the charity and risk assessed. And sadly, like obviously just in the news yesterday, making sure there's enough carbon monoxide detectors, things that you may not immediately think of, but more generally, loss of your regular funding sources. What would the impact of the charity be of that? What's the chances of it happening? Key members of staff, if you lost them, what would the impact? If you lost the trustees again. If complaints were made against the charity, you know, what's the chances of that happening? Fraud, obviously I've talked about that, security of your assets and also specifically cyber security. So these are just some ideas that really should be considered in a risk strategy. I'd imagine that all the trustees that are sitting in the room are sort of feeling rather weighed down by all this responsibility at the moment, and everybody here that's not a trustee is thinking, I'm glad I'm not a trustee. But to me, the point is that if trustees cover these matters, then it gives greater confidence that you're running the charity properly, but also I think gives comfort that where OSCR to come and make inquiries of your charity, then you have a good defence to show, yes, no, but I have policies in place, and no, okay, this didn't quite work, but this was the reason that we did this, we kept minutes, this was when we made this decision, this was what we recorded, we thought about this, we decided on that, turned out it wasn't the right idea, but we were acting in the best interest of the charity, and we can show it. And then, as I say, you'll sleep easier for knowing that you have all of that in place. And I say that the other issues, I say, are really just sort of standard things really to consider, but obviously wanting to keep public trust and volunteers. A lot of charities are sort of very reliant on volunteers. And so if you want the volunteers to be supportive of the charity. So we're on to our last section, you'll be relieved to hear, and it's to the changes that have come in. So I said earlier that there were changes earlier this year, some this month, and some that are yet to come. So the changes that came in earlier this year, I say the changes to the annual return are the sort of biggest things, and there's some other sort of changes that are relevant. You've possibly already seen the changes to the annual return, but basically there's new questions on it. And the questions are really OSCR trying to encourage trustees to have dealt with things, but also to make sure that trustees understand what their charity does. And so that's why there's a new question in the charity's own words. So it's not the charity objects, but actually, in your own words, this is what my charity does, our charity does, and this is how we achieve this. And it's so that really that the charity trustees can show that they understand it. And then I say a governing document mentioned yet again, but yes, they want to know if you've changed it. What they really mean is, if you've changed it, why did you not send us a copy? So again, it's a prompt for that. Induction process, OSCR view that as a sort of key to good governance, and so they would query that you actually have an induction process. And again, if you tick and say no, then they'll probably write to you and say, well, here's the guidance and this is what you need to do. I say that they're just really trying to help. And again, with do you have enough trustees? You'll only know that if you've read your governing document. So it all gets back to that. Really, and as you can see, they ask you when you actually read it because they think you don't. So that's why they're asking for that information. And then there were some changes to their powers, and there's more changes in that respect still to come. But the main thing was when Oscar makes inquiries and investigations into a charity prior to this change, they could only say negative things like "don't do that anymore," and now it's a positive action. It seems such a basic thing, really, but so it's things like you must appoint more trustees, or you must bring in this policy. So it's actually telling you to do things rather than sort of stopping you doing what you were doing that was wrong. And as I say, they've got other powers. The one about inquiring into former charities, it just means that if somebody has actually a charity been removed from the register, that doesn't mean that they're off the hook. If they've done something wrong, that now Oscar can still go and sort of make inquiries of them. The removing the power to remove charities from the register. If you go onto the Oscar website now, there's a list on that actually of charities that are at risk of removal. Mainly it's because they haven't sent in accounts for quite a long time, and so Oscar think that they've ceased, or if they actually are not doing any activities at all, then Oscar are saying to them, well, really, you still hold yourself out to be a charity, you're not doing anything, we think you should be removed from the register. So it just gives them a few more powers on that. The changes that just came in this month, they're not huge at all. A charity must have some kind of connection to Scotland. To be honest, I always thought they did have to have that, so that was news to me. But some other changes. I say that this now got this register of removed charity trustees, and that's actually quite useful, because if somebody comes to your charity and says yes, they would volunteer to be a trustee of your charity, then you do actually have to go and check, have they been disqualified from being a trustee previously. So it's called the Record of Removed Persons. And I say other sort of minor changes. More interestingly is what has still to come. So charity accounts being published on the Oscar website. Now you probably think, oh, that already happens. Well, it does, but not in full. Right now, if it's a company, then it just says go and look in Companies House. If the charity is not a company, then there's a redacted set of the accounts that are on the Oscar website. So it takes out trustees' names and the name of the independent examiner and that type of thing. So going forward, and probably next year some point, charity accounts will be published in full. And so what they are saying is if there's any information that you don't want in the public domain and it's not relevant and you're not required to have, you might not want to put that into your charity accounts. Trustees' names. If you go onto the Oscar website at the moment, it doesn't give you a list of the names of trustees. And if you look at the accounts, they're redacted. So you don't know who the trustees are. Going forward, that's all going to change. Oscar will want to know who the trustees are. They will actually keep their own internal record of trustees, and they'll have contact details and all these sorts of things. All that information won't go on to the public record, but it's intended that they will actually show the names of all the trustees. If you go into Charity Commission website and look at one of the English or Welsh charities, it already does that. So it's really just bringing that into line. The changes to who can be a trustee is just really tightening up the rules. I think it was MD that was on the Sex Offenders Register can't be a trustee. So again, that's just tightening things up. The number of volunteers, it's something they're going to start asking for in the annual return. So it's just a wee bit of pre-warning that if you do have volunteers in your charity, then you need to start having some sort of system to record how many volunteers there are, because you're going to be asked in future. Larger charities have already got to record that in their accounts anyway, but I say it is just a change that's going to go into the annual return. And the last thing really is that just there's more inquiry powers. So there was a lot of things that sort of came out of this latest act that made changes, but some of them need further legislation. And then when they get that, they'll have more powers to ask charities and others. And I haven't made it clear who these others are, but they're just clearly going to be able to get more information on the charities for them to carry out any inquiries. So I can see that is just about coming up for 12, which is lunchtime. Hopefully, although I don't know exactly where lunch is being served, but until I do find out, does anybody have any questions? Yes.
It was just under the notifiable event.
Yes.
So significant financial loss was a charity, say if we lost a significant grant because the grant funder decided that grant was no longer available or our application failed, would that be something that we'd have to notify about?
My interpretation of significant financial loss is you're actually running at a deficit. However, if the loss of that grant was so significant that it might affect the charity's ability to continue, then I would have said that was something to notify. And I'd probably say, like, err on the side of caution. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, I think David will organise that. Yes, Despite my protest that I didn't want to be recorded, I wasn't given an option. Somebody else had their hand up. Yes.
Trustee meetings and AGMs, do they have to be in person or are online meetings acceptable?
Online meetings are acceptable, but I feel like a broken record. Check your governing document. So if a charity that's been there for a long while, their governing document will say it has to be in person. So change the governing document to say you can do it online. If you go on to the SCVO website, they've got a model constitution for a SCIO, and there's paragraphs in there that refer to online meetings and rules for that, and Zoom and such like. So if you're wanting you can copy that bit to update your governing document. Yes, you had a question.
It was about risk assessments.
Yes.
So if you're doing activities, we normally have a risk assessment done before we actually go to the place. So is it okay if it's a member of staff doing the risk assessments, or do you need to get an independent person to do that?
The trustees should risk assess the charity as a whole. So when you're talking about specific events, I would say that the overall risk assessment is when you are carrying out activities, then that is risk assessed as an individual matter. And therefore, yes, the member of staff can do the risk assessment. It's the trustees have to make sure that the policy is there for that individual risk assessment, is what I would say, yes. Yes.
If a charity is subject to audit, would you expect the audit to cover the whole range of compliance issues that you've addressed?
Well, up to a point, it is a financial audit. However, when we carry out an audit, actually everything I said on risk assessment is what we do for an audit. So we do look at the risks affecting the charity, and we would be looking to see if the trustees had carried out a risk assessment. But we would also look at regulations. And when we're looking at regulations, what we're wanting to consider is, are there regulations that if the charity didn't comply with these, they could be closed down? So yes, up to a point, we would be looking at these sorts of compliance matters, but not everyone in detail. It's more as it would affect the charity's accounts and the charity as a going concern is what we would look at for an audit. But you do get a lot more out of an audit because we do look then into what are the systems and where are the risks, and we always have recommendations. I've never done an audit and not had at least 2 pages worth of recommendations, because there's always things that can be done differently. Yes.
With regard to the statement made about volunteers,
Yes.
is that for paid volunteers or volunteers who are unpaid?
Paid volunteers.
Well, there's a lot of volunteers get payment with regard to, even as a charity shop or something like that, they get a remittance, right? I run with a whole team of volunteers, it's very fluid because of commitments. Nobody takes anything at all, they don't get expenses, they don't get anything. Is that what they're after, or is it people who are involved in the organisation who actually get some sort of remittance or expense? Because nobody in my charity gets any of that.
They haven't made it clear on what the recording is going to be. I would say that for volunteers, if you're a volunteer, you're not getting paid as such. Now, there are tax rules, and maybe Martin will help me out in that this afternoon. There are tax rules on like payments that can be made to volunteers. Again, it's like a reimbursement of expenses. In the same way that I said that's fine for trustees, that's kind of fine for volunteers as well. So they would still be classed as volunteers, but I don't know yet exactly what Oscar are going to be asking about. But yes, but I would have said that a volunteer is a volunteer and it would count, is what my guess would be. Okay, are we?
Right, I've got one thing I want to ask. So, before we rush off to lunch, and I know it's getting a bit chilly, I'll go and chase them up about the heating. Can I ask about this top comment? Because I was the one who's getting a lot of the feedback on that one. So, the issue was around the availability of experienced qualified auditors. So, can I ask you, do any of you have difficulty locating an experienced qualified auditor?
I spoke earlier this week. My current auditor, who we've been with for 20 odd years, the person qualified for charities has just retired, and there's no one to replace him, so I'm actually in that boat. About I spoke to you earlier.
Okay, right. So no, yeah.
Not so much auditors, but charities trying to send stamina and getting that connection is quite difficult as well.
I do it.
Well, the reason I mention it is not only are the charities commenting on it, it's such a widespread issue that our professional organisation, the ACCA, have raised it. So it's surprising that in this room there weren't more hands going up, because collective. Yeah.
So I have a question about so we have an auditor, but we've had
Address it to.
we've had
I'll
the
only
same
ask you the question.
we've had the same auditor
Uh-huh.
for a long time.
Right.
Coming from business,
Uh-huh.
we are encouraged to, turn that over regularly. So, is there any particular either law, guidance, or best
Yes.
practice?
There is guidance. If an auditor has audited a charity or a company, audited anything for 10 years, then there's certain safeguards that need to be put in place. So it's not that you cannot continue with the same auditor after the 10-year period, but there's just sort of additional safeguards to be considered. And charities quite often, when they get to that 10-year period, they feel that they're better just to get a new person, and sometimes it just gives you a new perspective. I certainly, whenever I audit something for the first time, I will always pick up on things, and it's just because it's the first year of doing it. So it's not that you can't, but the 10 years is the sort of guidance.
So the other half of that complaint issue is whether the audit delivers value to the organisation. And what the ACCA, which is our professional organisation, were addressing is complaints that the audit was being done almost just like a kind of, we'll do that for the regulator. Whereas what Fiona's been emphasising all the time is that in every audit, there's a whole batch of recommendations to assist you. So my question is that applying out there in the field as well? So if you get an audit, or let's expand it, just your set of accounts. Are you getting any advice with it or not? No. Right. Okay. So that bit's justified then. Right. Okay. Well,
I think the issue is when you're a small charity, we're sort of growing. When you're a small charity, it's okay because it's going to running along. And I think sometimes the accountant says that we're not going along with you and we're just going to give you the same service. But as you're growing stature, I think that's when the accountants really should be intervening and saying, I think you change the way you're doing the accounts. Because we've been approached by an accountant to say that we're not complying with Oscar's accountants. So we're now moving to make sure that we are doing that through the Oscar regulation.
do you have any advice on how to get that additional advice attached to the accounts? So clearly it's quite a widespread issue.
Yes, come to me.
Right, well, that's all I want to deal with at the moment. Please do, as I say, have a blether, because these are the things which were mentioned, and several people had said I'd like to talk to some of their peers amongst you about those issues. I believe lunch is about to be served, and just to remind you, toilets are out that door and turn to your left and keep going till you get warm, and you'll see that the sign just above you. In the meantime, can I just ask you to thank our speakers? Thank you very much indeed. And thank you. We'll see you back here at 1.